Hi, and welcome back to Neon Liberalism. If you're online, if you pay attention to the news, and you probably do because you're listening to this podcast, it can kind of feel like an avalanche of shit is coming towards you all the time. A cavalcade of horrors emanating from the Trump administration, whether that's deportations of various kinds of horribles and their deliberate celebration of these deportations, their gleeful firing of the federal workforce, their performative disdain for human dignity. Um, it can feel pretty overwhelming. And what the hypothesis I want to explore today is that this isn't a distraction. This isn't an accident, but rather that this spectacle is a deliberate part of the political project of the Trump administration. And so, to talk about it, I'm very excited to have on Alan Elrod, President and CEO of the Pulaski Institution, contributor to Liberal Currents, and a returning friend of the podcast. Alan, thanks so much for coming on.
It's good to be here. Thanks, Samantha. Yeah, I mean, the thing you started talking about it just at the outset, uh, I very much disagree with the distraction language. I don't know why people keep insisting that, federal agents being used to round people up or to patrol the streets of an American city is a distraction. So I feel like I think it's good at the top that we're saying, this isn't a distraction. It's very much like the core crisis that we face.
Yeah, and you recently wrote a piece for us. What's that title again? Let It Burn: What an Immigration Raid on Washington Firefighters Can Teach Us About MAGA Fascism. So first of all, can we go over the immigration raid? Like, what actually happened out there?
Essentially, what happened is that this is actually because it's in Washington State. It's actually up on the Olympic Peninsula. This wildfire. Um, Customs and Border Patrol agents essentially showed up with two crews. These were private crews contracted to fight this fire, um, and they just started checking identifications. They lined them up. They stopped them from doing what they were doing in order to do this, and then they took two people away. And so, you know, part of what's shocking is just the idea that they would do this in the middle of a
And a
wild.
wildfire.
And DHS has tried to sort of cover their tracks on this. They've said, well, these people weren't actively, they were in a support role. They weren't actively fighting the fire. But every element of what firefighters are doing during a fire is fighting the fire, right? So just because they may have been doing things like chopping wood or rendering support in other capacities, that doesn't mean they weren't fighting the fire. These are all important things for fighting the fire. We now also know, thanks to reporting from State Line, that some of the leaders involved, some of the actual commanders involved in fighting this fire, worked with DHS actually to dispatch these crews kind of away from the main part of where the fire is being fought in order to facilitate this sort of. I call it a raid because I think raid language is more helpful because it's stark and I think it provides the necessary shock. But basically to facilitate this interrogation by CPB, and so I think that it's a great example of how far things have gone. Right, the Biden administration had a pretty clear policy of not doing any kind of border or immigration actions during natural disasters. Because you don't want people, even at the you would think even at the relatively extreme end of people who believe in deportations and all of this, you would not want DHS interrupting emergency services in the middle of dealing with a disaster, whether that's a fire or flooding or anything like that, in order to conduct ID checks. That just seems absurd. And so I thought it was a pretty useful way to start talking about some of what we're seeing, because it is just so shocking.
Yeah, I mean, right, these are people who are out there putting their lives on the line to fight a wildfire, to stop a natural disaster, one of these recurrent wildfires that we're always having these days, that are getting worse because of climate change. These aren't MS-13 criminals who are doing X, Y, or Z. These are just, hardworking, honest men trying to do some good for our world. Yeah, and then DHS pulls up in their, black SUVs and is like, yeah, everybody stop doing what you're doing, line up, we're checking papers. Like,
Yeah.
it just seems kind of grotesque in a way, like un-American, I would say. And yet we see so much of this, right? We see masked men jumping out of unmarked cars and grabbing college students off the street. We see, what do they call it, deportation asthma, where they make these videos like celebrating the fact that they're sending people to, fundamentally like a prison no one ever leaves. We have a word for that, right? Down in El Salvador, celebrating the mistreatment and maltreatment of people in that prison. Um, it's kind of hard to deal with. And I guess I should ask you, what do you think the deeper significance of this is?
Well, I think it cuts on a few levels. One, arresting firefighters, I think, communicates very clearly how committed they are in a sort of total way to this project. Because if a person coming here willing to do something as dangerous as fighting wildfires uh, cannot in any way be considered American, right? If that's not enough, right? Then no one stands a chance, right? Then there's really no way for there's nothing that you can do that will earn you their respect, right? If we even saw reports from some of these firefighters, right, that it's not just that they checked IDs, they took people away, they didn't give them a chance. Some of their colleagues were saying, "Hey, can we FaceTime their families?" And they said basically the agents were, cussing at them and basically saying like, "No, we'll do, get away. We, essentially like let us do our jobs. Deal with it, right?" And this is, oh, again, right. This communicates pretty clearly that, right, if you haven't earned, basic dignity from what I think is, firefighters are basically superheroes, right? They're one of those categories of modern life that children aspire to, right? Kids dress up as them for Halloween. Firefighters come to schools to give safety talks. I mean, they're like alongside doctors. They're kind of considered the like do no wrong kind of heroes of modern life because what they do is run into flames in order to protect, right, people and wildlife and infrastructure. That's kind of an absurdly, commendable thing to choose to do with your life. And so the fact that these people can't even, it's not just that they're being rounded up, they're not even being given basic dignity. I think that communicates, well, if these people aren't going to be given even a
Mm-hmm.
little bit of dignity, who is? Um, so that's one of the really crucial elements to it. And I think another aspect of it is just the sign of how far down the path we are in terms of DHS is doing a huge recruitment push, and what they want are the kind of people who want to do this, right? They don't, you know, this conversation has included a lot of people saying, I thought they were just going to send up criminals. I thought they were just going to round up gang members. And there were probably people there certainly were in DHS who joined DHS because that's the kind of work they wanted to do, right? They wanted to kick people out of the country who were actually dangerous. They wanted to help defend the United States from reasonable security threats, right? Send people out who were here doing things like committing acts of violence or engaging in illicit drug trades, things that do happen. Right. And now what I think we see is DHS in the midst of this massive recruitment push, making it very clear that they want people who are willing, I think, to really engage in just sort of outright thuggery against the general population. And you do that both through the ads and the ways you try to recruit, but you also do that just by constantly having actions, right? Immigration enforcement actions that demonstrate what you're about. And so, you know, to me, it's this combination of the sort of transformation, and I hesitate to use that word a little bit because I know that there's been a rot in DHS for a long time, but certainly it's a further evolution, perhaps, rather than transformation of the organization.
Yeah.
And I think the sort of clear message from this administration that if you're thinking about coming here and you're thinking, well, I'll demonstrate to them that I have value, that I am actually the kind of person they want to keep. Well, we're not even considering, firefighters, so don't bother.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, I think thuggery is a good word for it. This kind of performance on the ground of unaccountable power, the cruelty and the relish and domination that we see from ICE agents
Mm.
is pretty vile. And also, it's hardly restricted to the shock troops, so to speak. Right? This is something we see straight from the top of the Trump administration, and there's a word you used in your piece that I was very struck by, kakistocracy.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the kakistocracy of the Trump administration?
Well, yeah, this is the idea of rule by the worst, right? If aristocracy is ruled by the best, kakistocracy is ruled by the worst. And, I think in the first Trump administration, this word got thrown around, and it had more to do a lot of times at that point with the sort of level of qualification, right? There was a lot of people who were, at best kind of C plus choices for the job for the reasons that are obvious, right? That a lot of people didn't want to work for Trump, that Trump is a kind of a giant black hole of corruption, and therefore certain types of people gravitate towards him. Uh, but I think in this particular iteration, right, in the second Trump administration, it really, really is not just about people who are not qualified, but about people who are willing to enact a certain regime, right, of rapaciousness and cruelty, and thuggery, like I said earlier. And you see that everywhere. The fact that we have someone at DOD who's fine with Donald Trump saying he wants to send the National Guard into Chicago or New Orleans, and is also fine with the fact that they're playing around with changing the name back to Department of War. The fact that we have RFK Jr. doing what he is doing at HHS. These are people who are not just unqualified, and so ruled by the worst in that sense, yes, but also they have fundamentally corrupt characters. They're just deeply morally flawed people.
Yeah, so I think this is interesting. There's a concept from political science that gets used about authoritarian regimes called negative selection, where the idea is in a functional democratic regime, people are selected for their position based on their qualifications, right? That's positive selection. Your good qualities enable you to rise. And in authoritarian regimes, it's actually the opposite. People get promoted because they are incompetent. They get promoted because they are stupid. And this is a way, because the leader is functionally trying to make sure that he doesn't have any rivals, right? If you promote somebody really competent to be, in charge of the armies, people will start thinking, that guy, maybe he could be a good leader of the country. And so you can't have any of that. And this is just kind of like a personality trait often of authoritarian leaders, that they just don't like people who are qualified, and they promote people based on incompetence. But I think you're right to emphasize we're seeing something much more than that, right? These aren't people who are just incompetent, but they perform a kind of gleeful malevolence, towards whatever the disfavored group of the day is. Maybe that's immigrants, maybe that's Democrats, maybe that's cities, maybe that's judges, but they are willing to go out there and just hate whoever they're supposed to hate and to perform that. So I think that's important to understand, that we're seeing, yeah, something more than just a dysfunctional regime, but a regime that's actively selecting for evil, frankly.
Yeah, and I think what really concerns me is that this is going to have a kind of long tail to it. When we talk about how we get out of this, I'm someone who believes at this point it's going to take a while. It's going to be a generational fight. But one of the problems is the way that this administration, I think, is trying to remake public culture. Uh, you know, there's going to be a challenge, absolutely. Just a basic sort of problem of how government institutions have been overhauled or eliminated or defunded. And there's also going to be a personnel issue on the front of, there being judges that are I think not very committed to liberal democracy throughout the judiciary. There's going to be people in certain parts of the executive branch that have been put pretty deep in there, that are aligned with Trump. And that's something that people have talked about. Don Moynihan has talked about this. Jonathan Last has talked about this. But what also concerns me is the way that I think enduring this for years, because we're still in the first year, right? Remakes public culture, right? A generation of young voters only know this. It doesn't mean they all like it, but it's what they are used to. Um, Certainly a lot of other people do like it, and those people are being encouraged to join government agencies so that they can participate, right, in this kind of rapacious, violent, aggressive enforcement of immigration laws and other things. And I think also you can cultivate it. There's I don't think character is necessarily a fixed thing, and so people can become more open to some of these practices over time. And this is where I find, Lawrence Rees has a new book, The Nazi Mind. He's an excellent scholar, particularly of Nazi era Germany. And his focus in this book is really the psychological process by which the German people came to not just accept, but really embrace Nazism. And part of what he comes back to regularly throughout the book is that it's so effective that he has these encounters with contemporary Germans, older Germans who were alive during that time or just after, who still basically endorse Nazi attitudes and see Germany as having been on the right side of history in some way. And I think that's really important because uh, it shows just how powerful these kinds of things can be, right? You can really transform a national culture over time. Now, they don't have the totalitarian grip, right, on media and everything else that Hitler did. But, if you keep doing these actions, you keep demonstrating this kind of, I think, bloodiness, this sort of violence and aggression in public, and you keep pulling people who are willing to participate in it into it, right, through government recruitment, and also I think just through endorsing a sort of wider attitude towards immigrants that's quite hostile. Uh, then you really can start to reshape culture, and you're also sending the message that the way to get ahead in American society is by your willingness to demonstrate a certain kind of brutality and aggression. And I think that has very deleterious effects, not just in the short term, but in the long term. It means we're going to be faced with a country that has just been essentially like marinating in all of the worst kind of impulses of human nature, at least for the next few years, if not longer.
Yeah, so I kind of want to push back on this a little bit. Maybe I'm pushing back on this, but there's a phrase you see bandied around on the internet sometimes called meme authoritarianism,
Hmm.
which is kind of striking because it suggests that what Trump is doing isn't really so much recreating the actual structure of the Nazi Party, but rather like a kind of like a LARP or like a cosplay of past historical atrocities. Because, like you say, the OG fascists and the communists, for that matter,
Hmm.
the totalitarians of the 20th century were all deeply interested in culture, in the politics of spectacle, right? There's a reason that the Nazis were always doing these big marches and putting them on film, and they had their own newspaper and they had their own radio stations. There's a reason that Mussolini was obsessed with watching newsreels of himself so that he could perfect the performance. Next time, there's a reason Stalin was involved in like reviewing the production of all the films in the Soviet Union. All these people were deeply interested in culture. But also, they had standing right behind them a lot of men with guns who would show up at your house and like kill you if you talked shit about the culture, right? And like today, yes, ICE is pretty awful, and they have been leveraging it against certain people who express views they don't like. But I also don't think, we're having this podcast here right now. I don't think the Sturmabteilung is about to come through the door and stop me, right? They don't actually have that kind of bureaucratic apparatus of terror to back up the spectacle. So I'm curious of what you think about that dissonance with past historical authoritarian movements.
Well, yeah, I mean, we don't live in a totalitarian society. It's very hard to even achieve one, I think, in the 21st century, right? I mean, the best example is North Korea. Even in Russia, where Putin's pretty good at cracking down on critics, right? The internet and just the nature of 21st century life make it easier for dissidents to exist. And yeah, no, and that's sort of what I meant earlier when I said, the Lawrence Rees comparison, it only works up until a point, right? Because Donald Trump doesn't have like a total grip on our news media or on the films being produced or anything like that. That's not the world we live in. But I do think it's still true that people take cues, right, from key places in society in terms of what values are being extolled, in terms of what sort of principles are being held up as ones to embody. And if you have, I think, a clear message from the top, and the president is certainly the top, that the ways in which you can get ahead are to be willing to be ruthless, right? A certain kind of ferocity, right, towards your fellow man. I think that does still matter, and it does still affect civic culture and so the way we think about public service. And I also think that the message being sent very clearly by this administration is we don't really care or want the public servants who are here to do the job because they care about just sort of putting their head down, putting a good day's work in for the public. Those people can go, right? USAID, people in public media. We're going to shut those kind of places down. We don't really care if a bunch of like dedicated career servants at HHS leave. What we really want are people who are enthusiastic about the application of power and the application of this particular government's set of priorities. And that's what government life should be like. And I think one of the challenges then is how do you unspool that, right? Because, okay, the next administration can come in and Democrats could go about a purge, right, of the federal government. On one hand, I think they probably have to. On the other hand, the general public probably looks at that and says, "Oh well, tit for tat," and then it becomes this kind of thing where the general American population just thinks that what elections are now about is getting in, booting out the people you don't like, putting your people in, and running roughshod over each other. Now, I don't think that would be an accurate way to understand the ways we might need to try to rectify the situation after Trump if we get the opportunity. But it would probably be how a lot of people would internalize it. And I think it shows just how, in my mind at least, how easy it is to actually sort of loosen and unmoor liberal democratic commitments in a people. Because that's, I think, the really core thing is that we think of these as steadfast values and principles that people will simply never abandon. And the reality is, it is actually pretty easy with the right circumstances to push people off those positions and towards the things in human nature that have often, frankly, did govern how societies ran. Liberal democracy is in many ways the great exception. It's a miracle. It's a wonderful project, but it is a rare blip in human history. So it's not that hard, I think, to push people towards those other parts of human nature. And to me, that's where the historical comparisons really matter. Because what we're talking about is not one-to-one structural comparisons about how Nazism is Trumpism. What we're talking about is how fascism is, in fact, powerful because it plays to existing aspects of human nature in all of us. And it matters right now that the to go Lincoln on us, right? That the better angels of our nature are being muffled, and that what's being called forth in us is actually all of our worst sort of instincts and impulses.
No, I think there's a lot in there that I agree with. I think these days you see a lot of people self-flagellating over what liberalism did to provoke Trump or Trumpism or MAGA or fascism. But I mean, if you take it just a little step back and look in this longer historical perspective, like you say, liberal democracy, a free society where we treat each other decently, that's the outlier, right? The historical norm is much more about rapacity, about us versus them, about societies that are, dominated by hierarchies of class and sex and race and other forms of oppression. That's the historical norm. And it couldn't really be the historical norm if there weren't something in us that made it possible. And so I really do see Trump and MAGA as tapping into these kinds of atavistic drives. Um, so, yeah, I mean, it's something that we do. We can't assume it has no staying power of its own. We can't assume it's going to evaporate, but it's something we need to actually slug it out and win. Um, and so I think that's absolutely true. And I kind of want to come back to why that matters on a structural level, especially in today's age. Because to me, I see in some ways the Trump attempt to meme authoritarianism into existence as kind of a parallel with the left's problems with horizontalism. Um, where for much of the 20th century, the ideal of leftist organizing was the Leninist party system, right? Where we're gonna yeah, I mean that's just true. Where yeah, we're gonna have a party and it's gonna have a platform and it's gonna be hierarchically organized and we are going to like have a certain amount of party discipline and we are going to pursue the overall political project of the party, which is of course socialist revolution, but like you can deploy that kind of structured party system to other means. And none of that really works anymore. Right? We are not in a situation like everyone's always like, oh, we just need to get back to a more organized, more disciplined party. And it never seems to happen because the world we live in, it's too hard to enforce party discipline. Right? It's always possible for someone else to get on their phone and say something else or do something else or join some other movement, right? It is. So we have these movements, right? These various uprisings, the George Floyd uprising, the Black Lives Matter movement, that aren't really organized top down by some centralized party, but are organized horizontally, right? Of people being on their phones, getting engaged, being enthusiastic, as you say, about the cause, and taking action on that basis. And I see meme authoritarianism as the right trying to do that, basically, right? That they don't have the party apparatus to control society in every detail. What they're trying to do is get people to be individually enthusiastic about the program and to go out and take their own initiative to pursue that kind of life, that kind of lifestyle, that kind of end, those kinds of hatreds. Do you think that's an accurate summary of where we are?
I absolutely do. And in fact, I think that's kind of, I didn't use that language, but that is an element of what I was attempting to get at in the piece, right? Which is that there's a part of this is just about cultivating the authoritarian impulse in individual Americans, in sort of calling that out into being, right? It's almost participatory authoritarianism, right? Where we want this kind of grassroots way of people being willing to join ICE and enforce these rules in the most right, sort of heavy-handed, aggressive way they can. Um, no, I think I genuinely do believe that that's true. It also means that it connects with something I've talked about the other sort of virtue piece that I wrote for Liberal Currents earlier in the spring, and in both of these, I talk a lot about Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone thesis. And I think the reason that that is important, this sort of idea of joining not just politically minded and maybe civic organizations, but just generally joining, clubs and things that bring you into your community, is actually that I also think we have to really think a lot about saving democracy as a project of cultivating democratic impulses again, of reinvigorating, right, the things that make liberal democracy good. And the way that you do that, a lot of times, isn't always directly political. It's about putting people together in groups and having them spend time around each other, and certainly maybe do cultural things, right, art shows and bowling clubs and movie clubs and all sorts of things, right, elks lodges matter as well, things like that, uh, sports, all these things that fundamentally erode, right, I think, authoritarianism in people, because you spend time around people who are different from you. You naturally, I think, over time, when you build relationships with people, the desire to dominate them usually dissipates a little bit, right? Strangers are easy to want to dominate and control. People, neighbors and friends, are not. That's also true about a lot of human psychology and human nature. So, sometimes I think one of the challenges that people, and in this case, I think with the left, we can include not just the left, the hard left, but really everybody from the sort of center to the left, in terms of people who have an idea about whatever they want, some degree of what might be called progressive politics, is that they only think about these problems politically, and they're just not. They're just not strictly political problems. They're problems of culture. They're problems of character. They're problems of human relationship. And so democracy can't be, frankly, it just can't be strictly a political problem or proposition, because it will fail on those terms, because politics is deeply dissatisfying and unrewarding 90% of the time, because your side loses and people do things you don't like, and it's fractious, right? And so if it's just a political proposition, you're always going to have this kind of roiling discontent that I think makes authoritarianism attractive to people. But if you're willing to embrace, I think, the idea that it is a virtue to be cultivated, that it is a kind of civic process of knowing each other and being involved in things that don't have to be explicitly sort of policy oriented, in terms of coming together and organizing and bonding with one another, then I think it actually can be quite vibrant, and it's really exciting. This is, I think, to me, one of the places where, and I don't know if you would call it conservative, but this may be one of my sort of small c conservative beliefs, which is that you just can't sustain a political system of democracy without sustaining a culture of democracy. And I think too often people want to just sort of wonkily work around the policy edges of it, or try to fix the sort of institutional problems without just addressing the fact that at the end of the day, if you're not cultivating a public life for people that is fulfilling and edifying and reaffirming of liberal democratic ideas and values, then you really have a pretty weak foundation for your democracy.
So I think that's basically inarguable. Like you say, you cannot have democratic political institutions if you don't also have a liberal culture underlying them. But I kind of want to push back a little bit on what you
Yeah.
suggested. Bowling Alone, Robert Putnam, that's not a new book, right? That wasn't released last year. It's what, 20 years old at this point? I don't know. I'm
Mid 90s was the
in
first.
90s, so several decades at this point. People have been bemoaning this decline in the civic associations of ordinary life, right, for decades. And no one seems to have been able to do anything about it, right? We're living in a world where, yeah, attendance at all that stuff has gone down. No one seems to have been able to make it go back up. And I mean, I think whatever. One argument you can make is that people are turning to a particular kind of politics because they're looking for that kind of belonging. But the kind of community they get from politics in the social media age is much more attenuated, right?
Mhm.
It's not about meeting people at your local union hall or whatever it is, but about like reposting or retweeting or posting some sick burn or reposting some sick burn or hating the other team. And this seems arguably more like a structural feature of our technological and economic situation, right? Like, like, to make this into a question, like, okay, yeah, let's say I take your point that we do need these kinds of little local associations and clubs and so forth to sustain a democratic culture. Well, we don't have them. Can we get them back? Is this like a practical proposal?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a fair question. I do want to say this on the phones because I have a lot of thoughts on that, which is I think you're completely right, and we have these two kind of at times they're sort of oppositional, but at times I think they actually work together in bad ways. Sort of forces at play, I think, with our phones, which you said we're longing for connection, so we want that, and sometimes these far right politics presume or purport to offer connection. At the same time, our phones are the reason we're longing for connection because while they might enable sometimes us to meet up with people we never would have met and make some connections, by and large the bulk of what they do is to alienate and isolate us, right? And they turn us all. I think our phones and social media actually, in a way, empower us all to be little authoritarians in our lives. I get to block people, and I get to choose what I consume, and I get to kind of engage in this very, I think, confrontational. Sort of communication all the time with people I don't like, and I get to praise people I do. And even if I'm just sort of a participant and not, or an observer and not a participant, right? If I'm just sort of watching other people, a lot of times I'm sort of watching people have internet fights and enjoying the sort of conflict that often unfolds online. So that I think that in and of itself is cultivating some of the worst impulses in us pretty much every day, even if it's not explicitly political. We may not be going online and being like, I'm here to argue for, for or against reproductive rights. We may just be going online and arguing about much pettier opinions. But that ability to kind of uh, dictate exactly what we want to see, push away anything we don't like, be very dismissive, and live really in our head in a virtual world, because that's what we're doing when we're on those places, is very dangerous. And I think the other thing that it does is it heightens our status anxiety, right? Because we're constantly acutely aware of what everyone else has all the time and comparing ourselves. And authoritarianism is often very much predicated on this idea, not actually of flattening status, because that's not right. There's usually a false promise of egalitarianism sometimes by authoritarianism, but it is absolutely about channeling people's envy and jealousies of other people and desire to sort of take, or if not take, get what they consider theirs, in a particular system. I think that matters a lot as well. So I would say one of the biggest impediments to these sort of organizations, and the reason why I think it's gotten frankly worse, is that Putnam writes the first sort of article bowling around the mid '90s. The book comes out around 2000, and then everything keeps getting worse because he writes all of this, and then we get smartphones, which is just devastating, right? So now, not only are we not doing these sort of civic organizations and participation work, we're literally maybe not even interacting in the like few ways we had left. Like now, even we go to the coffee shop, and instead of talking to the person in line, we're just on our phones. So even those few fleeting places where you might have been able to like have sort of community interaction are vanishing. Um, my instinct here is that I I don't actually think I know the way out, because one of the big challenges is for liberalism is that we don't want to restrict access to these communication devices, because liberalism is all about a certain freedom of expression, and these things are actually important for expression, right? Our phones and these social media platforms. At the same time, they are definitely the thing I think that is most contributive on a daily basis to the erosion of a liberal democratic culture, because I think they just absolutely put jet fuel into the worst parts of human nature, and they enable all sorts of conflict and jealousy and status anxiety, and broader sort of cultural anxiety 24/7 to invade our minds. Um, I wish I had the answer. I'm glad you asked me for one, and I wish I had one. My short term response and my kind of more intimate response is to just tell people, well, you can make choices yourself. You can choose things. You can choose how you're going to spend your time. And if you are online, you can choose the way you're online. And when you have people in your life that you consider cutting out for political reasons, you make the decision to do that. I understand not everyone's life is the same. So for some people, going no contact with a family member or something may feel like an essential health decision to make. But by and large, you can make personal choices about the relationships you have, about the people you're willing to interact with, about the way you are with people. And that might not be the most satisfying, sort of big, master key answer to how we save democracy. But I do believe it has to start with trying to cultivate those virtues in ourselves and trying to go out and have those relationships in our own lives. Because that's kind of all we got. That's my only answer at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly some of that that's very relatable on a personal level. I've been on the internet a long time, and yeah, there were times in my life when I was just always picking fights with people online, and
Mhm.
I went online in order to pick fights with people because I wanted to be angry, right?
Yeah.
I wanted to be angry at somebody because it made me feel better about myself,
This is what
right?
authoritarianism understands about us, right? Is that being angry feels good,
Yes,
and
yes.
being hostile feels good. It's not necessarily it's a negative emotion, but it's not always negative to experience. It can feel great.
No, I think I actually, yeah, I was about to ask you all kinds of questions about phones, but like actually, I think this is more important. Um, and I think there are a lot of liberals who, like you say, see anger and cruelty as purely negative emotions, and they refuse to see the pleasures in them. And you might not like it, you might be morally opposed to it, but you do have to recognize that some people really enjoy it. Right, we had a piece here at Liberal Currents from Toby Buckle a little while ago about the politics of humiliation.
Yeah,
Um, and the idea that the act of humiliating someone else can feel really good. Um, I don't think it provides what you might call a lasting and durable sense of self esteem, but it can, in the moment, make you feel better about
it's a
yourself
sugar
because
high. It's certainly a sugar high.
so yeah, I mean, I guess, and obviously we just see this everywhere. To bring this back to Trump, we see it everywhere in what Trump is doing. That this particular delight in being on top and having somebody be below you, right? The yanking everybody's chain about Greenland and maybe we're going to invade Greenland or maybe we're going to abandon Europe is just more than anything, I don't think it's driven by like a strategic consideration of Greenland. I think it's about like he likes bullying people because he enjoys it. And the people who follow him as part of this kind of cult of personality vicariously enjoy it. They get to participate in that sense of like power and domination. They get to think like, yeah, look at Daddy Trump showing all those other nations who's boss, showing the immigrants who's boss, showing the trans people who's boss, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I think we do have to recognize that kind of dark pleasure that people take in a lot of this stuff.
Well, this is why the sort of Mussolini's conception of fascism is very much like this shark that has to keep moving, right? It's all action. You've got to have this invigorating sense of doing stuff, and a lot of times the stuff you're doing is hurting other people and dominating other people, right? Unsurprising political philosophy from someone who was out there like stabbing people when he was a teenager. Uh, um, but at the end of the day, I think that is true, right? This is when we talk about Trump and Trumpism and MAGA having fascistic qualities. I think that's exactly what we mean. This idea that so much of it is about id and aggression and action, and so much of that action is directed towards a dominating, assaulting energy that is about at its kindest end, it's about getting a rise out of someone, and at its worst end, it's about absolutely, subjugating. You know, they're not upset that they sent the wrong people to CCOT. That's still a source of right. Like that's not the point. The point is the images of humiliation and pain, right? Toby said this very well. It goes, Adam Serwer with the cruelty is the point. Charlie Sykes kind of modified that with an essay called "The Brutality is the Point." All of this evokes what we know is kind of a fundamental truth, right, of Trump and Trumpism, and what's being done right now in our politics, which is it's less a clear set of political propositions and more a sort of massive energies that are about directing malice and violence and, like Toby says, humiliation and domination at specific groups and at anyone who really dares to disagree or with them or defy them. And I think that's really important. But I mentioned in my piece, this is going back to the cultural transformation of the country. That what you have are agencies that very much want people who are eager to take pleasure in those activities themselves, who really do see this as exactly what they've been waiting for, right? An opportunity to not just get to indulge these impulses, but to do it with the imprimatur of the American government. And I think that's a particularly dangerous place to be. It's one thing to know that this is a part of human nature and that a lot of people have these impulses and that we all have a sort of dark side to our psychology that can enable us to take pleasure in other people's pain. It is another thing altogether to have a government that is very much instituting that as a kind of platform and offering that outlet to its citizens on a daily basis.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I kind of want to emphasize that point though about how we all have this capacity in us. Because I don't really want to portray this as okay, well, delight and cruelty, that's only something the right is engaged with. I
Mhm.
mean, again, I think you can log on social media any day of the week and see people from all over the political spectrum who
Yeah.
take a certain delight in starting online flame wars where they get to point at somebody else and show how bad they are and delight in the ability to like hurt them through dogpiling them.
Yeah.
Right? I think this kind of dark energy is in all of us and oftentimes and expressed all across the political spectrum, even though, as you say, it is one branch, one side of politics that is like not just that stuck a toe in it, but has like made it their whole raison d'etre.
Right.
Um, right, has made it into their fundamental political project. So I want to recognize that. Um, but I kind of also want to ask you to go a little deeper into something you said before about how can we cultivate the better angels of our nature, right? If we think that it really matters to fight out these culture wars, to win these culture wars for liberal values and liberal ways of being, um, how can we cultivate liberal virtues, liberal values in this kind of social media age?
So, I mean, the first big piece of sort of hypocritical advice is just to spend less time online. But I recognize one that I'm bad at that, and two that may ultimately not be advice people take. So, my follow up would be to change how you spend time online. Uh, I, One thing I would encourage people to do, sincerely, if you're on a place like Blue Sky, which has a pretty powerful block, is actually to block fewer people. I know that might there are people who say, well, you should just get them out of your feed. I would say actually, seeing things you don't like and don't agree with and not allowing the impulse to go down the most kind of vitriolic path that your brain might want to send you down uh, is an important thing to cultivate. It's a habit, but you have to learn it. You have to actually train yourself, right, over time to not instinctively go to sort of your angriest or darkest place when you see things, even things that offend you. I think it is tough, but we have to actually want to model a world where things that offend us, yes, and we are capable of speaking in defense of the virtues we think are being transgressed against, but where we also are capable of restraining ourselves from suggesting that some sort of evil should be visited upon every person who says something we don't like. Because it does bring us down into the mud and into the dirt, and it does reduce us. Uh, people will sometimes say, well, this is just sort of both sidesism. And my response is, well, it's not that. It's the fact that we are damaging our own selves when we do these things. And we're not producing any kind of interaction that's edifying for us or for others. So yeah, I mean, sure, it might sound cheap, but there is a degree to which you actually have to try to be better, uh, and that doesn't seem satisfying, and that doesn't seem rewarding in the moment, right? When what you really want to do is, frankly, sometimes someone who seems like they really deserve it, go after them. Uh, but if you can channel that into, at minimum, not engaging, and frankly, at the best end, maybe choosing to engage in a different way. Stopping, slowing down. Do you know how disorienting I find it when you want to get into a fight and someone comes back at you with, hey, I think I misunderstood you there. Or like, hey, no, I'm not mad. Let me explain where I'm coming from. And you go, oh man, I was about to be a real jerk to this person and I would have, or I was already, and now I regret it, because that can happen all the time, right? And I think it's really a good thing to maybe say, not just can I walk away from a fight, but can I actually stop and pivot and say, hey, this feels like it might be going in a heated direction. Here's some things I think. And then also, tangentially, maybe, here's some other thing that we can bond on that doesn't have anything to do with this fight we were maybe about to have.
So yeah, I mean, I personally appreciate that kind of conversational judo, and I think it's important. But there's some things in what you said that, I mean, that I agree with. It really tempt me in a lot of ways, but I'm also troubled by,
Yeah.
right? That there's this old saying, a liberal is someone who's, won't take their own side in a fight. Right. And this comes back to not just a point about culture and individual conduct, but some of the things you gestured at earlier in terms of like, should we purge the federal bureaucracy if we ever get a
Mhm.
chance again? And you said, well, maybe that would be just a tit for tat situation, and that would be, we can't stoop to their tactics. We have to recognize the diversity of opinions and the rule of law, and et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, I think you can look at the first Biden administration basically as an attempt to do everything you just said,
Yeah.
right?
And
We aren't going to prosecute Trump for his role in January 6th. We aren't going to prosecute any of his administration officials for any corruption or malfeasance that they may have engaged in office. We are going to reach out to Republicans. The fever is going to break. We are going to get back to this
right.
place of national comity. And none of that happened, and none of that worked. And now here we are. Right. So I guess my question is, how can we balance these two things? Right? How can we balance the need to like fight, the need to actually fight against these people, sometimes in like using the actual levers of governmental power, but also like to fight them in a cultural arena with retaining these genuine liberal values of decency, of toleration, of openness, of respect for diversity? How do you balance that?
Well, here's what I would say. I want to be clear that the advice I'm giving about restraint and those kinds of things is very much about interpersonal interactions. I believe we're going to have to actually do purging. I think the next administration should add DC and Puerto Rico as states. I think the next administration should be aggressive about being willing to make massive changes in how personnel decisions are done in the federal government. I think it's going to be necessary to do a lot. Here's what I'll say. Uh, it matters, for example, let's go back to Nazi Germany. It matters, for example, whether you're going to do the Nuremberg trials or whether you're just going to shoot people. And I'm not suggesting right like any kind of like public executions, but what I mean by that is it matters if what you're just pursuing is revenge, or whether what you're doing is trying to actually fix things. I believe in a robust, muscular defense of liberalism, absolutely, and I think in the context that we are in, it will be necessary to even prosecute people. But it matters that, my concern with that was just that the American public might see it as a tit for tat. And then we're stuck in a kind of situation where there's a pendulum swing all the time where they just say, where the average American doesn't view these things as the sort of necessary steps they are. But from my own personal perspective, I mean, I absolutely think it's necessary. I don't think, you can have what was sort of the Biden Merrick Garland approach. I think you need a really aggressive, uh, you know, thoroughgoing. I guess I would use the word maybe purge, although that suggests.
You need to workshop that word.
Yeah,
We
it's
need
not
to
great.
find a different
It's
word.
extra. I don't mean something extrajudicial. I mean actual procedural uh, reckonings, right? Where we say we're going to prosecute people who broke the law, and there have been a lot of laws broken already. And if they broke the law and they're found guilty, they're going to go to jail, and they don't get special treatment because it might be seen as partisan. No, if you're going to have to just be willing to say a number of people currently serving this administration need to be investigated. This is why I always say, I think this is where the sort of liberal sweet spot is. This is why I always say these people must be investigated, and if there is evidence, they must be prosecuted, and if they are convicted, they must be jailed. And I'll have people who then will say, "Why do we even need these steps?" I'm like, "Well, because that's how you do it, right? That's how you live up to the liberal democratic principles and still dish out, right, the necessary, I think, punishments that might have to be dished out. That's how you do it. You do it right. You have due
Yeah, I mean,
process.
I think to
Say,
take just
we're going to
one.
give you. I mean, to me, well, that's part of why Nuremberg is such an amazing moment in history. We gave the Nazis due process. We hung a lot of them. I'm not suggesting that we hang anybody in the Trump issue, but we gave them due process. And in a way, I feel like that's actually the kind of crowning aspect of the defeat of Nazi Germany, is that we really spit in the face of what they were doing. We didn't just beat them, we beat them, and then we put them on trial the way a free society puts people on trial. And then when they were convicted, we punished them knowing that it was backed by the sense of justice that comes from being, convicted in a court of law and with due process. And I think that is something that hands you the moral high ground. So yeah, I mean, I'm for really dealing aggressively with the crimes that are being committed. It just has to be done the liberal democratic way: due process, investigations, prosecutions. Absolutely, if they're convicted, take them to the maximum end if you want of the proper sentencing, but do it the way we have said society is supposed to run.
I think there's something very much to that. You know, how can you really prove to the American people that liberalism is better if, in the breach, you're willing to throw those principles out the window?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think one. Well, actually, I'll ask you about an example. You've talked about prosecuting people in the administration. One
Yeah.
thing that I think has happened is that the executives of CBS have committed a pretty unmistakable case of bribery,
Yeah.
um, by choosing to settle a defamation lawsuit against Trump in very favorable terms in order to get a certain merger approved by the government. They, you know, both parties on both sides of this transaction basically said that they were doing it right. This isn't one of the things where you need to like speculate and like find some like backroom deal. They just said it in public. Knowing that they wouldn't be prosecuted today because the people they were bribing are in charge of the prosecutions. Um, but I feel like that's something, if we take back power in 2028, the statute of limitations on bribery won't have run out. Should we be thinking about prosecuting individuals in the private sphere who engaged in corruption under the first Trump administration? Because that's a question I want to kind of add onto that. This line from your essay,
Mm.
where you say our project will by necessity be one of remaking national life. And I'm curious, like, how thoroughgoing and how much do we have to do that?
When it comes to private companies and people who have engaged in some form of corruption or another, in terms of appeasing this government or just being opportunists, I think it's probably a case by case thing. One of the things I think is important is that it's clear that this is an authoritarian administration, and I'm cautious about the idea of punishing people for just trying to get by in this system. That doesn't include CBS. Like what they've done, I think is egregious, and I think there should be an investigation. Again, this is why you go back to due process. You say we're going to launch an investigation, right? And then you do it the right way. You appoint, you direct independent, right, agents of the federal government to do their job, and then every step of the way you say we're not going to stop it, right? If there's evidence found, then it proceeds to the next place. I think they've been pretty out in the open about it, but I think there's also people in organizations who are placating Trump out of pure fear, and I'm weary of just punishing places for being afraid of this administration, because of the what I am, and I think, do you go after CBS? Yeah, I think so. Do you go after like every university that bent over backwards to this administration? I to me that feels like an you're just continuing to apply the federal government's immense powers, in ways that do not necessarily feel conducive to free expression. And I understand that it's in that sense it's about rectifying, but there always has to be a limit on the sort of what you do to reconstruct. There always has to be a boundary. So I think we have to be thoughtful about where we set them. And I think the biggest and most important thing is just that there's a clear sense in the instances where we do prosecute people that there's a due process that they're being given. To me, that's the thing that matters. I'd be perfectly fine with criminal investigations and prosecutions against CBS and Paramount and Skydance and all those people. Uh, as long as it proceeded along the lines that corporate crimes used to be prosecuted, in the before times when we had a system that respected due process.
Yeah, I agree with that fundamentally, right? I think, again, if we want to be the party of liberal values, we have to be the party of liberal values, and that means, like you say, both sticking to due process when we're engaged in these kinds of prosecutions, but also like actually being willing to do these kinds of prosecutions in the first place and not chickening out of some misguided sense of comity or bipartisanship that simply doesn't exist. Um, and so I guess my last question for you is going beyond the question of prosecutions, going beyond the question of online choosing to be less hostile or more open online, if we do regain power
Hmm.
and we are engaged in this project of remaking the national culture, how do we do it?
Oh man. Um, I do believe that um, we've got to find ways to demonstrate our values with where we spend our money. I know that's how everybody likes to talk. You demonstrate your values where you're spending your money, but you know, the destruction of something like the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Okay, well, I think that's a terrible thing. It's also now an opportunity to come back and build a public media system for the 21st century and say, okay, how do we think about where healthy, available, right, accessible media for the public good can be made and distributed in the 21st century, right? Because really, TV was that thing in the 20th. And I think now we need something that says, how can we get out there and build those sort of similar media systems in the 21st century in ways that are actually like built from the ground up for it. That's one thing to me. I think that's really important. We've already talked a lot about how the internet is a bad space in a lot of ways. Well, that was in some ways the argument that was made for public television back in the 50s and 60s, which was television has become this kind of wasteland of advertisements and game shows, and we need something that's edifying and that is good for people, and that because it's a public service is free to access for them. I
So
think
we need the corporation for public posting.
yeah, honestly, that sounds crazy, but like I don't have like a fully fledged notion of how I would think all these things have to be implemented, but I do think a big amount of investment in public art, in public media, uh, that is about creating accessible locus points of conversation and communication and education for people, that is not invaded by all of the sort of gross partisanship and commercialization that dominates digital media right now, is really important. I think that's crucial. Creating those spaces, funding those spaces. I would love to see a lot more money put into art and heritage institutions across the country. I think we need more of them in places like where I live. Right now we have a handful of good museums in Arkansas. They're not accessible to people in more rural or remote parts of the state. I think spaces where people can come together, we need to consider how you fund those. I mean, I don't have like a preferred how you do it, right? But I do have a sense that the government itself should be involved in helping to encourage these things to happen. Right? I would say, go back and rather than cutting, triple the previous national endowment for the arts funding. Right? Uh, that's I think where the battle is fought. Right? Cultivating expression. For people. I mean, those are my instincts. Is go back. I would look at that and I would say, whatever the CPB had before, whatever the NEA had before, whatever the NEH had before, triple, quadruple it, and not in a way that's about. We've seen, not in a way that's about dictating what gets made or funded, but just pouring, I think, money into individual people's free decisions about what they want to do and make and I think promote. But those organs that I think are about the stuff that really makes civic life great, art and history and conversation and media that edifies and extols rather than what we're bombarded with a lot of the time, which is we just have so few places right now where we can escape uh, that deluge. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but that's one of my answers.
Yeah, I mean, I don't 100% know if I'm satisfied by that answer, but I
Yeah.
certainly believe that, this is the time when we need to start thinking differently, when we need
Mhm.
to start spitballing, so to speak, and trying to figure out what we're going to do about this problem and hopefully what we can do about it if we take power back. So,
And we do have an essay on liberal currents. Nick wrote one about increasing arts and public media funding, which I think is correct.
yeah, I think that's revitalizing the liberal spirit in America up on our
Mhm.
website right now. So yeah, Alan, thanks so much for coming on and talking through all these issues with me. And thanks to everybody for listening.
Thank you.
Cheers.